I always think it's important. You can't be expected to learn a whole language before you go on a trip, but you can easily learn even a handful of words. Is really just making the effort to say please and thank you and good morning and so on. And one example of that I have is the Italian word piacere, which means it's a pleasure. So when you're meeting someone, you say, oh, piacere. And I was at a big family gathering at a friend's house, being introduced to 20,000 aunts and uncles at this thing and cousins. And this is my friend Matt from America. And I just looked out at the sea of faces and I said, piacere. And they were all, oh, he knows piacere, he knows piacere. They were so moved that I even knew that. And thank you all for coming. It's always nice. You always wonder if anyone is going to show up. So I'm really happy you're here, and I hope you'll enjoy the talk tonight. So I'm Matt, and I am a travelholic, as reflected in my title of my book. So what I wanted to do is tell you a little bit about my background and how the book came to be and how I got to do so much traveling. And then I'm going to share some stories, hopefully whet your appetite for wanting to read more in the book. I was born here in Massachusetts, in New Bedford. And my parents lived down in Rochester, Massachusetts, which is just outside of New Bedford. And I was born in November of '58. I was the only child. And after my parents had been married for 7 years, my dad left us, ironically, on Father's Day of 1959. So if you have to leave, I guess that's the time to go. So at that point, my mom and I were forced to move back into New Bedford with my grandparents, and that's where I was born and raised for most of my childhood. So in good AA format, my name is Matt, and I am a travelholic. Some of the early indicators of that, my first word after mama was car. My mother said I would sit in the window and just point and go, car, car, car. As Zoe mentioned, I have made about 45 round-trip cross-country road trips in my life. I lived in California for much of my adult life, but I had friends and relatives here, so I would always come back. And so the entire country is kind of like my backyard. I've done every highway there is going across. I put 130,000 miles on my last car in just 4 years. And I turned that one in and bought a new one in just 2 years ago in August. It already has 60,000 miles on it. The people at the Honda dealership are horrified. They're like, what do you do? So as Zoe also mentioned, I've visited so far 35 countries, and cumulatively I've spent about probably a year of my life in both Hawaii and in Italy. They're probably my two favorite places on the planet, and I think the photos maybe show you why. They're as different as night and day, but they're equally wonderful. So chapter 1 of my book is, the title of the chapter is I Blame It All on My Mother. I was a psychology professor in my career at my university. And if you've read any psychology or pop psychology, of course, everything, all our neuroses and psychoses, we blame on our mother. It all had to do with our mother. So I think mothers get a bad rap for that. But in this case, it's definitely true because I think my mother passed on her love of travel and to me. So when I was a kid, we often did, she didn't have a lot of money. We were living with my grandparents. She was working full time. But whenever she had 2 nickels to rub together, we would do some kind of trip. She loved going out to the Cape and up to northern New England, New Hampshire, and Maine in particular. We would go to the aquarium in Boston. She's one of the few people I know that never feared driving into Boston. Her girlfriends would ride with her, but she was always the designated driver. And one of my favorite childhood memories was what we called mystery rides. So on any given Saturday or Sunday, she'd say, get ready, we're going to go out. And I would ask where we were going. And she'd say, we're going on a mystery ride. And so I would try to guess where we were heading based on the direction we were driving. If we were going west, it's like maybe we're going to the park at Roger Williams where they have pony rides. Or if we're going southwest, maybe we're going to Sakonnet Point and getting clam cakes and chowder. So, but we would listen to the radio together, share our favorite songs, and just talk. And the old adage about it's not really the destination, it's the journey was really true. It was just time together to talk to one another and be together. So that's a particularly good memory, and I've done that to some of my friends in my adult life. They'll say, "Where are we going?" It's going to take a mystery ride. You'll see. We'll end up somewhere. Here's some interesting photos from my childhood. The one on the left is interesting. My grandparents on my father's side lived out in Illinois, and my mother was on good terms with them. And so one day she decided we were going to go out and visit them. We were going to do a road trip to Illinois. And my Massachusetts relatives were horrified, and they said, a woman alone with a little kid can't be driving halfway across the country. And her reaction was basically, bye, we're heading out. That picture in the middle, that is not me, that is Monkey Jungle in Florida. And then on the right, that's her at the World's Fair. I suspect that my mom had travel addict tendencies herself. If she had had more money, I think we would have done even more traveling, but we did a pretty good job with what she had. In fact, I even think that my mother's travel ideas went beyond the Earth. She was a huge fan of Mr. Spock on Star Trek, and I joke here that if she had, in a parallel universe, Mr. Spock would have been my stepfather. So to go where no mom has gone before. So during my childhood, that's me. I was a Lost in Space fan. That's my Lost in Space shirt. When I was a little boy, I was really good at directions at an early age, and I loved reading maps. So oftentimes my mother would get one of her friends, and we would drive up to New Hampshire or Vermont for an overnight, and they'd be talking their adult talk in the front seat, and I'd be in the back seat with my maps. And then I would break in and say, "Mama, we were supposed to take a left back there on 103 North." And the adults in the front seat would just, keep quiet back there. But I would notice that suddenly my mom would just quietly turn the car around, make a U-turn, and go the direction that I had told her. And in the words of one of her friends that was on some of these trips, she said, "You were 6 or 7 years old, for God's sake, and you were always right." So I really developed, and that's my gloating smile when I'm right about my directions. Well, unfortunately, my mom had a rather short life. She developed cancer when I was just 15, and she died at the age of 45 years old. She had multiple bouts of cancer, many visits to the hospital in Boston. And during that time, I would often go from New Bedford to Boston on the bus. I would visit her during visiting hours at the hospital, and then I would go and stay at a hotel in Boston, do my homework, use the pool, have dinner, go back the next day, occasionally get back on the bus and go back to New Bedford to wash my clothes and get my new schoolwork and stuff. And many people, and even myself, look back on that and say, "You were only 15 or 16 years old. How did you do all that?" But I really credit my mom, because she taught me how you order in a restaurant, how you use, what kind of a tip to leave, how to check in at a hotel, and so on. So it was her, her training, her guidance that allowed me to get through all this. So she died when I had just turned 16, and I was ending up living with my grandmother in New Bedford after she passed. My mom and I had always wanted to go to California. That was our big dream. And we either never had enough money to do it, or as her health deteriorated, we never had a chance to do that. And so when she died in January of 75, and I decided I was going to go to California for us. So I went to a travel agency in New Bedford. I look back on this too, and I think, how did a 16-year-old walk into a travel agency and say, "I'm Mr. Davis, I want to plan a 10-day trip to California." I joke, I think in the book, that I said that I guess once my check cleared, they took me seriously. But I planned a trip on my spring break. I was a junior in high school, and I flew out to San Francisco for 5 nights, and then hopped on a plane down to LA and spent 5 nights in LA, and took bus trips down to Disneyland and Knott's Berry Farm and San Diego Zoo and so on. And that was the beginning of my love affair with California. And that is me. And it's good that it's not a color shot, because it's a bright blue leisure suit from the 70s. But that's me at the Fairmont Hotel having dinner in 1975. I liked California so much that when school was out that same year in June, I went back to the West Coast again alone. They had these crazy fairs that year where if you flew to the West Coast, you could make as many stops as you wanted in the continental United States. So I flew to San Francisco and spent a week, and then I went down to LA for a week, went over to Phoenix, took a bus tour up to the Grand Canyon. I went to Las Vegas. I remember seeing the comedian Bob Newhart at the Riviera Hotel. And again, I wonder how, as a 16-year-old, I was able to talk my way into a casino. You're supposed to be 21, but I just walked right in. I was at a table right by the front of the stage. And then I stopped in Chicago and visited my relatives there. So I was pretty precocious. And then in '76, when I graduated high school, I was 17, and that was my first cross-country drive to California and back. So a little bit about my history. I got my bachelor's degree in psychology down at what is now UMass Dartmouth down in near New Bedford. I went to William and Mary in Virginia for my master's, and then I moved out to Southern California and got my PhD at UC Irvine. When I finished my degree there, I moved to San Francisco. I had fallen in love with San Francisco and was going up there any chance I had. And I got hired for my first and only full-time faculty position at a small school called Dominican University of California, just about 20 miles north of the city. And I taught a whole bunch of classes: social psych, media psych, statistics, human sexuality. My specialty was natural disasters. I did research on natural disasters. And I also developed a class on the psychology of travel. Because I started to do so much traveling, I figured I had to academically justify that by doing something academic and creating a course. If you're a travelholic, academic life is really a good lifestyle because it gives you so much freedom and opportunity. So we had summers off, of course. We get about 5 or 6 weeks off at Christmas. There was spring break. There were long weekends. And then you could, if you played your cards right, you could really work your work life around travel to a large degree. So one of the things that I did was, you have to do research. It's the whole publish and perish thing in academia. And when my first sabbatical leave came up, they want you to go and take a semester and do research on some topic. And I said, well, I'm interested in natural disasters. Where can I go that they have natural disasters that would be a great place to hang out for a few months? And I thought, Italy has disasters. I'm going there. So I ended up spending a couple of months in Italy on my sabbatical. Conference presentations. I would look through the professional journals and newspapers and look for conferences and say, oh, there's a conference in New Zealand, there's a conference in Japan, Greece. And so I would apply to those, and if I got accepted to speak at the conferences, the university pays your way to fly to the conference. They put you up in a hotel for a few nights at the conference, and then I could go on my own nickel for another week or two and see the area and do traveling on my own. So I was able to work that pretty well. And then also, as Zoe mentioned, I was a study abroad instructor on several trips with my students. So I would lead students to trips. We went to Italy several times, Greece a couple of times, and then these other countries. And again, the university would pay for my trip to go to shepherd the students around. And so it was, a free trip, basically. So it really worked out well for me. That's one of my favorite pictures. That's me at the McDonald's in Pompeii with Mount Vesuvius in the background. I joke that all the Big Macs there are well done. So on the left there, you have a list of the places that I have been so far. And I want to tell you a little bit about how the book eventually came to be. What I was doing, when I was doing all this traveling, I would write emails from wherever I was, and to all my loved ones back home, and I wrote really long emails. I would sit at the hotel at night and write. And I had the foresight to send the emails to myself as well. So when I got home, I had basically a ready-made travel journal. I had all of these emails that I had written on the spot, and then I compiled them into, put them into a Word file, embellished them a bit, to put the names of those restaurants that I had visited and so on, and have more of the details. And so I had an interesting experience on one of my trips back here, visiting my relatives. My Uncle Harry one day, he led me into the garage, and he had like a treasure chest that he opened up. It was every single email that I had written on all my trips, printed out, and my Aunt Helena had saved every single international postcard that I had sent them for all these journeys. And my uncle's, I think his words were, if you don't get this thing published, Matthew, I'm going to do it for you. So I was really touched by that. Unfortunately, they died a few years ago. They did not get to see the book come to fruition, but they were definitely an inspiration as much as my mom was. So the next step in the process was on another sabbatical from my university in 2016, I created a travel website, and that was my sabbatical project. And before you leave tonight, if you want to buy a book, great. If you don't get a book, I do have bookmarks up there that have my website address, so you can go to the website. And if you log into the website, this is what you'll find. What's kind of fun is there are different photos of me in different places. So every time you log in, it's a different one. I might be floating in the Dead Sea. I might be riding an elephant. You never know what you're going to find. But this is my travel website that I created. I have blog posts that were a lot of these stories about my travels that I had written. I have my photography. I have travel recommendations. I have world music. I'm really into particularly Hawaiian music and Italian music, and I got to be a DJ at my university. So I had my own Hawaiian music show and my own Italian music show. You can access all of those and get introduced to the latest top 40 in Hawaii or in Italy. So this was the beginning of the process of trying to get my work out there, if you will. So in 2020, I retired from my faculty position. I left San Francisco after 30 years, and I came back to Massachusetts, and I decided at that point that I wanted to write the book that I'd always kind of hoped to do. And I had finally had the time to do that. So I spent the next couple of years putting this together. I culled a lot of my stories from my blog posts, again, did a lot of editing and embellishing and making it a cohesive story. But basically, I selected some of my favorite stories, and the book has chapters on 13 different countries and from all over the world: Asia, the South Pacific, Middle East, and Europe. And my purpose of wanting to write the book was twofold. I think I have some really funny and in some cases sentimental stories to share. But I found with leading my students on all the study abroad trips over the years, I really wanted to inspire people to travel. I think a lot of people are afraid to do things, and I want to try and encourage people to just grab the bull by the horns and do it when you can and while you can. So these are the countries that I feature in the book with a photo from each chapter. And what I'm going to do is kind of go through these. I'll tell you a couple of stories about some of them, and I'll gloss over some of the others. But hopefully you'll get a sense of what the book is like as I go through it. So my first trip to Australia was in 2003. It was kind of, again, one of those really weird airline deals where if you flew, you could do a circum-Pacific trip, flying around the Pacific Rim, and as long as you didn't backtrack, if you kept going in the same direction, you could stop as many places as you wanted. I think it was over a 2-month period. So I got a lot of Asia and the Southern Pacific done in that trip. So Australia was one of my stops there. That's one of my favorite pictures. That was at a koala bear refuge. They are really cute animals. They're heavy as lead because all they do is eat and sleep. So not a bad lifestyle. They eat eucalyptus leaves all day, and then that kind of knocks them out. So I would rather have chocolate chip cookies, but it still sounds like a pretty good lifestyle to me. But I had a couple of interesting stories to share at my time in Australia. The first one was on Kangaroo Island. Kangaroo Island is a really cool place that's off the south coast of Australia near Adelaide. And I went out there, and literally there are koala bears in the trees. There's kangaroos wandering the island. It's a really wonderful, there's penguins and seals. And so I was going back to my lodge one night, and I was on a dirt road going about 25 miles an hour, and it was dusk, and all of a sudden a kangaroo came out in front of me. And if you think it's scary here in New England, the deer jumping out in front of us at night, you haven't lived until a kangaroo literally drops out of the sky, because they take one leap and it was in front of my car. There was no way I could have seen it coming unless I looked up. I hit it, and luckily I was going really slowly. I don't think it was seriously injured. I did get out of the car and try to see if it was injured, but it hopped off into the bush. My rent-a-car, unfortunately, did not do as well. Rental car company wasn't happy with me. So I limped back to the lodge that night, and I ended up having a kangaroo steak for dinner. It was kind of like my revenge. They do eat kangaroo. It doesn't taste like chicken. It's more like steak. But that was my revenge for damaging my rental car. The other story that's kind of interesting is my visit to the Great Barrier Reef. And I love the ocean. I could be in the water, 20 hours a day. But one of the things, if you've watched any of the Discovery Channel documentaries, you probably already know that like 10 of the deadliest species on the planet are all in Australia. One of the deadly species they have are the box jellyfish. And evidently, if they sting you, you have, if you're lucky, a minute or two before you die. It's a really toxic poison. So, and unfortunately, they are on the shores of Australia about 3/4 of the year and in most of the country. I went to a couple beaches where they have stinger nets, they call them stingers, and it's like a volleyball net that they put across the mouth of the beach to keep the stingers out. But it's like the days that I was at the beach, there were waves coming over these things, and it's like anything could float over that. So I was really paranoid about it. I wanted to go to the Great Barrier Reef and go snorkeling, and they offer you can rent a stinger suit to protect yourself in the event that there are stingers. So it is a head-to-toe suit, and it's made of the most unflattering material known to mankind, blue lycra, and I wasn't even sure it was going to fit me, so I wanted to try mine on before we got to the dive site. I came out on the deck, and one of the crew members stuck an upside-down coat hanger on my head and yelled to the entire boat, "Look, everyone, it's Tinky Winky from the Teletubbies." So there's me and there's Tinky Winky, so you can compare and contrast and see. But that was a humiliating but funny moment. On that same trip, on that same Circum-Pacific trip, I stopped in New Zealand next, which I call the land even further down under than Australia. New Zealand is absolutely beautiful. I ended up going back again a few years later to attend a conference, and then I spent a lot more time there. It is just unspeakably beautiful. The scenery is pretty much hard to beat. And it's not a surprise that they film so many TV shows and movies there because it has such an exotic look. You have glaciers and you have rainforests within 5 miles of one another. They say they have more sheep there than people, which is, in my book, that's just fine. It's the size of California, but it has only, I think it's about 4 million people, and California has more like 40 million people. So it's you and the sheep, and it's really lovely. And the lamb is fantastic, too. They have really good food there. My last stop on that same trip was Tahiti in French Polynesia. And that was an interesting story. People knew that I loved Hawaii. And everybody told me, oh, if you like Hawaii, you have to go to Tahiti. It is the unspoiled version of Hawaii. It's what Hawaii used to be. You'll love it. So I added it onto my itinerary. The picture on the right there is flying on a small plane from the main island of Tahiti to Bora Bora. That's Bora Bora there. And that was probably one of the most beautiful things I have ever seen in my entire life. But in retrospect, I wish I could have told the pilot, okay, that was great, now fly on to Maui, please. I found Tahiti to be so boring. There was nothing to do. I guess if you're there with a loved one and you just want to hide in your oceanfront little cabin, it's great, but there was nothing to do. Even that beautiful body of water there, you could walk out maybe half a mile to a mile and you were still at your knees. So you couldn't even kind of jump in for a swim. It's just very shallow. One day I rented a car and went over from Bora Bora from let me show you. I was staying out on this, what they call a motu, out on the edge of the lagoon there. But you could take a ferry over to the main island, and I rented a car for 8 hours to drive around the island. I drove around the entire island twice, and I returned the car 2 hours early. There was nothing to do. There was nothing to see. There were no galleries. There were no gift shops. There was nothing. So anyway, this was the beach that I stayed on. That was my little grass shack there in the middle picture. It's absolutely beautiful, but there was nothing to do. And I describe it as a weird combination between Survivor on television and that Tom Hanks movie Castaway, where he got so bored that he was talking to a volleyball. I was looking for a volleyball anywhere I could find one. I actually teased and said Bora Bora should be called Bora Boring. I had some other adventures on Tahiti, but I'll just share, I won't share those for now. Japan was a really interesting trip. I went there again for a conference and then was able to extend my visit. So I got to tour a lot of the southern part of Japan. I didn't get to Tokyo, but I was down in Kyoto and then down in places where Western tourists usually don't visit. At the conference, we were in a little town called Shimabara, and they were having a big festival kind of to greet all of the conference goers. So I wandered down to the street. They had drums and they had dancing and they had food booths and this kind of thing. And this little woman, like a third of my weight, grabbed me and yanked my hand. She said, "You have to help us make the mochi." And I was like, okay, I didn't know what that meant. And so if you don't know, mochi is a glutinous rice cake that they pound out, and it's a candy. They tend to have it especially at the Japanese New Year. So we were at these assembly lines, and you're rolling these mochi balls out with raw flour and molding them into balls. And if you've ever seen the episode of Lucy and Ethel on I Love Lucy where they're in the chocolate factory, exactly, but I didn't do that with these. But it was like that. I was trying to keep up, and I was hopelessly bad at it. At one point, this very nice gentleman said, "Oh, you must try the mochi." And he took one of these balls, again, it's raw dough with raw flour on it, and he shoved it into my mouth. My hands were all flour and I was busy. And I almost gagged. It was hideous. And I didn't want to offend anybody, so I just kind of, patiently kept it in my mouth, and then I excused myself and ran down a dark alley and spat it out. What I didn't know then was how dangerous that was. A BBC headline from 2018, "Delicious but deadly mochi, the Japanese rice cakes that kill." CBS World News 2022, a grim New Year trend in Japan. 4 women choked to death on traditional rice cakes, 12 hospitalized. Every year, especially during Japanese New Year, all these people around Japan are choking to death on these darn things because they're this sticky, gross stuff, and it gets lodged in people's throats. According to the Tokyo Fire Department, 100 people every year are hospitalized for choking on mochi. And it is so difficult, you can't dislodge it with the Heimlich maneuver because it sticks in your throat. So vacuum cleaner companies in Japan actually have an attachment to suck out the mochi ball if it gets stuck in your throat. So I was really happy that I didn't know any of this when my little excursion happened, but I think I dodged a bullet there. Another interesting culinary experience I had in Japan was also in this little town of Shimabara. I went into this little restaurant one night, like kind of almost a bar, and I never have had so much difficulty communicating anywhere in the world as I did in Japan, especially in this part of Japan. No one spoke English. Menus were not in English. I didn't know any Japanese. So I'm sitting at the bar, and they were so pleasant, but he's trying to talk to me. He kept typing things into his cell phone. And eventually he looked at me and said, "Sashimi?" And I was like, oh, thank God, a word I know. Yes, sashimi. I like sashimi. I like sushi. So I said, yes, sashimi. And so he walked over to the door. There was a fountain with fish in it. He pulls out a fish that's probably about this long and brings it over to the bar, slaps it down in front of me, gets out a knife, and serves it to me. It's like, sashimi. It's like, and at that point, I was so horrified. I didn't want the fish to have died in vain. So it's like, okay, I'll eat it. It was delicious. If you like sashimi, it was wonderful. But I also joke in the book, I was glad I didn't order the beef. However, I also found out something interesting about this little event. I remember him at one point, as I was happily chewing my sashimi, he said, "Blowfish." And I was like, oh, that's nice. Well, I learned later, blowfish is a really big delicacy in Japan. However, it has lots of deadly toxins in the skin and some of the organs, so you actually have to have a license to be able to even serve it, because it is deadly if it's consumed. So I assume that my gracious host had the license and the knowledge required because I'm still alive here telling the story. But again, I felt like I dodged another bullet in Japan. The next chapter of the book takes us to Egypt and Jordan. I combined them into the same chapter. They were on the same trip. We had taken a group of students and faculty to Egypt on a 10-day trip. And then I was going off on my own to Jordan and Israel after that. So my time in Egypt can be summed up by this next slide. Now I understand the motivation for the Exodus. I think Egypt is the only place in the world I couldn't wait to get out of. I don't think you could drag me back with 18 camels. I wouldn't go. We had horrendous experiences in Egypt. I was injured on a camel. Most of my students got horrible food poisoning. We got robbed. It was a fiasco. So I was really thrilled to get the heck out of the country. What terrified me, though, was my group was leaving and flying back to the States, and it was like, oh, God, now I'm going to Jordan on my own, and if it's anything like this, I'm going to be all on my own. Thankfully, Jordan was a totally, totally different world. In fact, when I got there, I had a Bedouin guide who met me at the airport, and he said, where are you coming in from? And I said, Cairo. And he said, oh, we hate Egypt. And I said, really? And he said, they come here to work, but they don't treat the guests the way we treat our guests here in Jordan. And I was like, well, that's a relief. So it was a totally different experience in Jordan. He took me to the ancient city of Petra, which if you watched in one of the Indiana Jones movies, you'll recognize that view of the ancient city. An entire city carved into sandstone, 2,000 years old. And then he took me out to his Bedouin camp. They are Bedouins. They live in tents. That was out near the Saudi border. We ate by a campfire. I slept in a tent that night. It was an amazing, amazing experience. So it was like night and day from Egypt. I loved Jordan. On that same first trip, I stopped then in Israel after that. And then, as you can see by my dates here, I went back, I think, 3 other times. So I've been there 4 separate times. The picture on the left is one of my favorite travel photos. That's me floating in the Dead Sea. And it's so salty that it's not only can you float really easily, you cannot submerge any part of your body. You try to force your hand or your feet down and they just bob up like corks. That's how much mineral and salt there is in there. So I was just out there having a ball floating around in the sea, and there was a woman with her kids on the beach. And I motioned to her, I said, would you get my camera out of the backpack and just take a few pictures of me out here? And so that was one of the shots she got, and it really captured the moment, because I was just like a kid out there floating in the sea. The body of water on the right, that is the Sea of Galilee, and that's in the area where Jesus met the fishermen. And beautiful, beautiful area. I loved Israel. I'm very sad, of course, about everything that's been going on over there for the last couple of years. I'll just say a little bit about these photos. That's flying into Tel Aviv on the left. The picture in the middle, that's taken from the Garden of Gethsemane, looking towards the walls of Jerusalem. So that would have been the view of the city from the garden that night. And on the right, that's the River Jordan, where John the Baptist baptized people. And they bring people from all over the world to have baptismal ceremonies there. Turkey was another of my Middle Eastern stops. I went there in 2014, and I spent a few days in Istanbul, and then I flew out to the center of the country to an area called Cappadocia. And that's the picture on the right. The picture on the left is the Blue Mosque, a famous landmark in Istanbul. And on the right, that is the Cappadocia area. It is like something out of the Flintstones. There are these amazing rock formations. And as you can see, they've carved them out. There's a window on the top of that. There are hotels and houses built inside these strange gnome hat kind of formations. It was really otherworldly. I had another kind of I Love Lucy moment when I went for a traditional Turkish bath in Istanbul. That's what they call a hammam on the left-hand side. I won't tell the story here. You have to read the book for that. But it was like I made a fool of myself, because it's a very specific process that you go through in the hammam. and I misinterpreted something. In the middle, that was an amazing hike I did in Cappadocia. They call that area Love Valley. And I naively went up to someone and said, why do they call it Love Valley? And they said, look at the shape of the stones. I said, oh, okay. Now I get it. And then on the right, that's the interior of the Blue Mosque, which is stunning domes inside. Italy. Italy was the most difficult chapter of the book to write because I had so much to say about it. I was like, I probably could have written an entire book just about Italy, and maybe I will sometime. But I have been there more times than I can remember. I can't even remember how many individual visits, but I've spent probably about a year and a half of my life there. One of the things I love most about Italy is, of course, the food. The gelato is otherworldly. I love the picture on the left. In the middle. I like the picture on the left too. The picture in the middle is one of my favorite travel pictures. It was a really strange little restaurant in Rome that I had read about on TripAdvisor, and they described a surly waitress who force feeds the patrons. And I thought, well, this I got to see. So I show up for lunch. I swear I had no sooner walked through the door and this woman's eyes met mine, and I was like, oh, that's her. I could tell immediately. And I get, the red hair, I stand out, and she just made a beeline for me. So sure enough, I ordered my meal. She actually wouldn't let me order. She was going to tell me what I should order and what to have. And I was like, okay. Next thing I know, she's stuffing bread in my mouth. She's force feeding me vegetables. She was actually really nice. Her name was Tiziana. But I wouldn't want to mess with her. It's just like go along with the whole routine. So one of the things I talk about in the book, and I used to talk about this with my students in my social psychology class, is that the Italians have a lot of very specific norms around dining and food that I wasn't aware of when I first started going there. Probably the number one most important thing is that they do not dip bread in olive oil in Italy. So any Italian restaurant here, they bring out the herbed olive oil and the bread. And so after my first 3 or 4 times in Italy, I noticed they don't do that over here. So I asked my friends, and they looked at one another, and they looked at me, and they said, no one does that. And I said, well, maybe it's one region of Italy where they do that. And I remember my friend Christian, he got very serious. He said, no Italian would do this. It's like, okay. So I don't know where that came from. I have no idea why it started, but they're really serious about it. I went into a small restaurant one night in Florence, and there was a young American couple that came in after me, and they're sitting at a table nearby, and the waitress brought them a basket of bread, and she went to return to the kitchen, and the man yelled at her, he said, excuse me, could we get some olive oil? And she looked at him, and he said, for our bread. And she just looked at him and said, no. And she turned around and went into the kitchen. And I explained to him after that, I was saying, this is the story. They don't do it. In fact, they don't have bread plates. I got into trouble at a friend's house, a family dinner. We're having dinner, and this was near Venice, and they speak the Venetian dialect. So I don't understand any Venetian. I know my Italian fairly well, but not Venetian. But I could tell his mother was pacing around behind me and saying stuff. And I finally said, Christian, why is your mother's mad at me? I can tell. What have I done? And he said, you're being very rude with your bread. And I said, I've never had that accusation before. And I said, why? And I was balancing it on the end of my dinner plate. And he said, you're balancing it on the plate. It's very rude. And I said, what am I supposed to do with it? He said, you put it on the table. It's like, oh. By not doing that, I was implying that her tablecloth was dirty. And if you go to any Italian restaurant in Italy, they have the fresh tablecloth that they put on for each new patron. There are no bread plates. There's therefore no olive oil. And bread is basically used to sop up the wonderful sauces on the wonderful pastas that they make. But they do not do it. I've made friends with some restaurateurs in Rome. And Daniele, he'll come over to me in the middle of a dinner service. It's like, what is it with the Americans and the English? They just want to drink olive oil like it is water. And we buy very good olive oil, but it is not to drink like this. So if you ever go to Italy, do not ask for olive oil for your bread. Another rule that they have is you don't drink cappuccino after noon. It is considered a morning drink only. Afternoon, you're supposed to drink espresso. And frankly, I'm not a big espresso fan. I like to savor my big cup of coffee with milk. So it's like taking a vitamin pill instead of having a nice meal. So occasionally I will play with this rule. I remember one night in Rome, I was with my friend Fabio. We had dinner. And at the end, the waitress came over and asked, "Cafe?" And that means, "Do you want an espresso?" And I just raised my eyebrows in a mischievous way, like I just might dare to ask. And he looked at me and said, "I will kill you." It's like, okay, I get the message. So occasionally, at best, they will just kind of give you a funny look. And at worst, they'll just outright tell you no. There's a restaurant I go to a lot. And one time I really wanted coffee after my dinner. And I asked the waitress, Barbara, I said, "I know it's wrong, but can I have a cappuccino?" And she said, "If you pay for it, you can have what you want." So they will bend the rules if they know you, but really it is not done. They give the explanation that you're not supposed to have dairy after noon, but then they eat cheese and gelato all day. So I don't get where I don't know where that comes from. The other big thing is you don't put Parmesan cheese on any seafood dish. So if you get linguine with clam sauce, don't ask for Parmesan. I was in Rome with a couple of friends, one of my early trips, and they had freshly ground Parmesan on the table, and I had linguine with clams, and I went to reach for the Parmesan, and my friend Patrizia said, no, you don't use that on seafood. And I said, "I know, but I love Parmesan cheese, and it's freshly grated." No. I remember he almost stomped his foot and said to our other friend, Alessandro, tell him this is wrong. You don't do this. And my friend Alessandro, who's a little bit more laid back, he said, if he wants to ruin his pasta, let him. But it's just not done, so do not ask for that. So the old adage, when in Rome, do as the Romans do, is a good piece of advice. And these are just some of my photos that hopefully explain why I love Italy so much. That's Naples with Mount Vesuvius on the upper left. That's the Cinque Terre, the Italian Riviera, under the 8 photos. That's the Dolomiti, the Italian Alps with the little church. That is the Amalfi Coast down on the upper right-hand corner. Down below that was a wonderful sculpture that a sculptor put in the Grand Canal of Venice. It's unfortunately not there now, but I was so fortunate to see it because you'd be coming down the Grand Canal and see these giant hands holding up the building. It was called Support, which I thought was really cool. Some wildflowers in central Italy, a really cool picture of Venice. I just caught the sun at the right moment, and the south coast near Puglia down in the boot. The United Kingdom is my next chapter of the book. I talk about Scotland, Northern Ireland, and England. Been there many, many times. The picture on the right is one of my favorites. That's called the Dark Hedges, County Antrim, Northern Ireland. Just a magical place. So Scotland is one of my favorite destinations. It's absolutely beautiful. I've joked that if heaven doesn't look like Scotland, I'll be disappointed. It's really pretty, and I did some great hiking there. But probably my most eye-opening experience in the United Kingdom was going to Belfast. And don't know if you've heard much about the troubles that they had in Northern Ireland. I actually had a very good friend who was from Northern Ireland, but she never talked much about it. And I knew that there was a lot of civil strife and rioting and terrorism and things, but I didn't really understand it too well. When I went to Belfast, or if you go to Belfast, one of the things you need to do is take a black cab tour. It's cabbies that worked in Belfast during the Troubles, and they tell the history of what happened, and they take you around the city. And I just had no idea. This is one of the I'm a naive American kind of moments. Basically, he would explain that being a cab driver in Belfast in the 60s and 70s in particular was the most dangerous profession you could have. If you were Catholic, a Protestant might call you and ask you to come with your cab to pick them up in the Protestant section of the city, and then they would rob you, beat you, or kill you. And likewise, if you were a Protestant cabbie, you would get a call into the Catholic neighborhood, and the same thing would happen to you. There is a huge wall that goes down the middle of Belfast. They call it the Peace Wall. It looks a lot like the Berlin Wall. There are factories and shops and so on all along the wall. and the Catholic neighborhood is on one side and the Protestant neighborhood is on the other, and people enter from the Protestant neighborhood, they go through their doors, and the Catholics come in the other doors. They work together all day, and then they go out their separate ways, and many of the gates are locked during night. At one point, this house in the middle here, in this middle picture, this thing that looks like a batting cage, and I asked my cabbie, I said, "What is that?" He said, "That's to protect the house from Molotov cocktails or rocks that get thrown over the wall from the other side." And again, I naively asked, I said, "Oh, is that to show us what it was like back in the 60s and 70s? And he just kind of shook his head. No, it's still a problem. It's not nearly as bad as it used to be, but there's still strife there. It just blew me away that two religions that are so similar could have this much strife, and I realized too there's also political stuff going on there with regard to Ireland and England, but it was really an eye-opening experience, and I really recommend that you check that out. And other than that, I loved Northern Ireland. It's at some of the most beautiful scenery in all of Britain, and Belfast, I actually preferred Belfast to Dublin. Dublin was a lot of young people getting really drunk and vomiting in the streets, whereas Belfast was much cleaner, much more beautiful. The Titanic Museum is there, which is fantastic. So Belfast is a really cool city. Croatia is the next chapter, and that is not me perched on that rock. I just took the picture. Croatia was an interesting experience. Croatia, my first visit was with my students. We did a Mediterranean cruise, like not a semester at sea, but 2 weeks at sea, where we held classes on board a ship, and we went through Italy, Greece, Croatia, and over to France. And we made a stop in Croatia, and it was my first and only time doing a cruise. I will probably never do it again. Hated it. I'm a very independent traveler. And I remember in Dubrovnik, Croatia in particular, we did a city tour, and then they said, after your tour, you'll have ample time to explore this wonderful city. And the tour ended, and they said, you have 45 minutes to be back on ship. And it was like, that doesn't even give me time to find a good bakery. You know? So it really frustrated me no end. So I did go back to Croatia on my own a few years later, and it was a better experience. I stayed in Dubrovnik in the old city. It's a wonderful old city with walls around it. What I didn't realize at the time is there are something like 4,300 stone stairs in the old town of Dubrovnik. And what I also didn't know when I made my reservations was the guest house I had chosen was at the 4,200th stair up. You know, it was all up. It was about 95 degrees in the shade when I was there. And I just climbed endless flights of stairs with my bag. That's my bag there. I stopped on this landing to just get my breath. And I remember thinking at this point, I said, this is where it's all going to end, Matt. You've traveled the world. You're going to die of a heart attack on a stone stairway in Dubrovnik. And the stairs, they were different heights. You know, they weren't all uniform, so it was just really strenuous. So I recommend going to Dubrovnik. It's fantastic, but go in a cooler month and stay near the gates instead of way up on the top of the mountains. The coastline of Croatia is also really beautiful along the Adriatic. Greece is one of my favorite countries. I've been there multiple times. I've seen about 8 of the Greek islands, and the islands in particular are absolutely stunning. As I told you earlier, I love being in the water, and oftentimes you have an entire beach like this all to yourself. I remember swimming at a beach like this, and I was the only person there. And when you're floating around on a Greek island in this beautiful water, my mind takes me to Ulysses and the Odyssey, and thinking about the Greek myths. And all of a sudden, on this beautiful day, I looked down into the water, and there was this huge white glutinous thing down below the surface. And I think I shot 10 feet out of the water, screaming. Luckily, there was no one else on the beach to hear me. And then I realized what it was. It was my thigh. I was looking through the water at my very pale thigh. And then I started laughing. And this is if my mom was watching from heaven, she would still be laughing at this, because this was the kind of thing that would crack her up no end. She loved the beach too, but it was just so absurd. It's like, what is that horrible thing in the water? Oh, it's me. And these are some photos from the island of Santorini, which is, if you have a bucket list, put Santorini at the top of it. It's one of the most beautiful places. Yes, it's crowded, yes, it's touristy, and it is beautiful. Even the German Shepherd appreciates the scenery. The last chapter in the book is on Iceland, and I've been lucky enough, I have to update this slide actually. I've been there 3 times now, and I just made reservations to go in November again this year. Iceland is a really, really cool place, and it's really accessible from here in Boston. It's only a 4 or 5 hour flight. I was lucky enough to go the first time in the summer, and you have 23 hours of daylight. Basically, I would have dinner at 7 o'clock or so and then go out for the next 4 or 5 hours and take sunset pictures because the sun just hangs in the western sky for hours. It might get sort of dark at 2 in the morning, and then by 3 it was light again. And then I've been several times now in November when you have about 4 hours of daylight. So you can sleep in until 10 because the sun comes up around 10:15 or so. So if you're a late sleeper, you never miss sunrise. It's great. And then it starts to set by about 3:30 or 4. But it's an amazing place. This is one of my favorite places that I've ever visited. It was called Jokusarlen Iceberg Lagoon. And what you see there is a glacier in the background, and bits of the glacier are breaking off, and then they float down to the sea. Like, it reminded me of the Rose Bowl parade, these majestic things of ice just floating quietly out to the sea, covered with seabirds, so the birds are all cackling and stuff. And I got to walk along this. There was no one else there. It was me and the birds. Just a magical, magical place. On the left there, that's the famous Icelandic horses with their manes that Farrah Fawcett in the 70s would have been jealous of. That's a turf church in the middle. They actually put plants, sod, and turf on the roofs of some of the buildings to keep the heat in the winter. And then this was a summer picture with all the fields and fields of lupin, just for as far as the eye can see. So the last chapter of the book is, I call it Feeling at Home in the World. And I try to give suggestions for how to have a more authentic experience when you travel internationally. The first thing that I recommend is not to fear traveling alone. I have a lot of people that say, it sounds like you did a lot of this traveling on your own, and I did. And I always say that if I had waited for other people to join me, I wouldn't have done half the things that I've done in my life. So don't be afraid to travel alone. One of the benefits is that you get to meet people that way. Think about that. If you're traveling with a good friend or a loved one, you're talking at dinner, you're not really paying attention to anyone else. But when you're alone, it forces you to kind of talk to the people at the next table, talk to your waiter or waitress, talk to the people at the hotel that run the hotel. So I now send more Christmas cards to Italy than I do to people in California because I've made so many friends just in my travels over there. So it's really a perk of traveling alone. Another piece of advice is to not overpack. Rick Steves, I'm not a big Rick Steves fan, and I know that sounds like heresy, but I think it's partly that I'm jealous of him. I want to be the new Rick Steves. I don't like a lot of his advice, but one of the things that I read in one of his books that I think is a really great idea, he says, if you're going on a long trip, pack your suitcase, take everything that you think you're going to bring on your trip, and then walk around the block 3 times in your neighborhood. If you're sick of it by then, you've packed too much. And it's really, really good advice. One of the funniest experiences I had, I was traveling with some students. They were meeting me in Rome, and then we were going to go on to Greece together after that. So I met them at the airport. It was 2 women and a man. And they came out at baggage claim, and the 2 women, I am not kidding, they had suitcases that were almost as tall as me on rollers. They looked like portable wardrobes. And my mind is racing. How are we going to get up and down the metro stairs? How are we going to navigate the cobblestone streets of Rome? And Danny had a backpack. These 2 had this. And I hesitantly, I said, well, let's go. And they said, oh, wait, we have more luggage. And they had to run back to the conveyor belt to get more bags. And I remember Danny yelling very loudly, I'm not helping you carry any of this. As it turned out, they had to mail back at considerable cost about 3/4 of their stuff. They brought like 10 pairs of shoes. It was insane, but they couldn't get the luggage. They far exceeded the weight limit on the flight to Greece. There was no way they could take all that. So pack light. Unless you're going to deepest, darkest Africa, you can buy whatever you want wherever you are. Makes great souvenirs to buy stuff. You can do laundry. One of my best experiences in Italy was I had to go to a laundromat, and I had the best time all afternoon. I got to talk to the laundrette woman who showed me how to use their high-tech machines, and then there were other tourists coming in that didn't speak Italian, so I was translating for her. I had a blast. I was like doing my laundry. Some other ways to kind of feel at home when you're traveling internationally. I always think it's important. You can't be expected to learn a whole language before you go on a trip, but you can easily learn even a handful of words. Is really just making the effort to say please and thank you and good morning and so on. And one example of that I have is the Italian word piacere, which means it's a pleasure. So when you're meeting someone, you say, oh, piacere. And I was at a big family gathering at a friend's house, being introduced to 20,000 aunts and uncles at this thing and cousins. And this is my friend Matt from America. And I just looked out at the sea of faces and I said, piacere. And they were all, he knows piacere, he knows piacere. They were so moved that I even knew that. So a little bit goes a long way in that sense. I really like listening to the music of the place. I'm not one of these people that I can't drive in Maui along the beach and listen to Bruce Springsteen. It just doesn't make sense. I have to hear Hawaiian music. When I'm in Italy, I listen to a radio station, Radio Italia, which is their top 40 Italian songs. It gives you a feel for the sound of the language and the sound of the culture. I recommend trying local foods whenever you can. Try to be adventurous. I have a lot of very provincial New England friends that are like, oh, I'd never eat that, I'd never try that. But I've had some of the most amazing dishes, and you ask the waiter or waitress, what do you like, or what's a specialty of this region? And I've had some really amazing surprises with food. And then again, learning about cultural norms of the place you're going to, like the Italian food rules that I was talking about earlier. If you're going on a long trip, a couple weeks, 3 weeks, whatever, have you ever had 2 or 3 weeks of your life when something didn't go wrong? There's always going to be travel disasters. And what I try to do now is when something bad happens to me on a trip, my first thought is, well, this is going to make a really great story when I get home. A couple of examples of that. I was driving a rental car in the south of France, and I made a wrong turn and turned into a pedestrian-only zone. And totally panicked and threw it into reverse and started to back out. And there were these concrete pilings that I didn't see, or that people are not, I've been there, and totally took out the tire and a lot of the fender and the back of the car. A crowd gathered, of course, a lot of young people, teenagers, and I was like, oh, they're all making fun of the stupid American that just ruined his car. They helped me change the tire. They were so sweet. It was the nicest thing. The rental car company, again, not as forgiving, but the local people were so sweet to step in and help me get the tire changed. Another really funny story about that was a lunch that I had in Paris. I went into this really charming restaurant. You just look at the outside and it's the quintessential cute little French restaurant. And they had a 3-course lunch special. So they seated me, I was in a window seat, and they brought the first course, which was onion soup, which how French can you get? I have had better out of a can of Campbell's. Then the second course came, it was steak and fries, and the fries were all soggy and the steak was inedible. It was absolutely horrendously bad, and that's unusual because French cooking is usually fantastic. I was so disappointed, but meanwhile, I'm looking out the window and people are coming up to the menu stand and they're looking at the charming restaurant. And so without trying not to get the attention of the owner of the restaurant or my waiter, I would try to make eye contact. I'd make big eyes at them and I'd go, and when they'd look at me, I'd go, and some people just looked at me like I was nuts and moved away, but at least I saved them from their fate. And other people got what I was doing and they were like, give me the thumbs up and run in the other direction. So again, the moral of that story is I paid a lot of money and I was really disappointed with that lunch, but it's one of my favorite memories of Paris because I had so much fun trying to save everyone else from the same fate. As I was finishing up the book, a good friend of mine down in Tennessee, Daniel, he said, I have a question for you. Why do you travel? And I thought, oh my God, I've just written this couple 100-page book about travel, and I've never really addressed that question in the whole book. So it made me think a little bit. And I think for me, what it is to experience things that you can't experience at home. You know, we're really, I think, fortunate in New England. We have a lot of variety, a lot of wonderful places to see. But if you want to go to tropical beaches, you know, that Cape Cod's not the place you're going to do that. So to go to really amazing mountains, and again, the White Mountains are beautiful, but going to the Rockies, Canadian Rockies, the Alps, seeing wildlife. The last time I went to Yellowstone, I couldn't believe there were bears and elk and foxes. It was like a petting zoo running down the roads. Seeing historic sites like Gettysburg Battlefield, or one of the most moving trips I ever took was to Auschwitz in Poland. Seeing natural phenomenon. I've been able to be close enough, as close as people are in the front row to me, to lava flows in Hawaii when the volcano's erupting, or seeing the northern lights in Finland or Iceland. So those are things that you can't see necessarily where you live. And I also think that travel opens our minds. There is psychological research that says that people that travel internationally they're less likely to stereotype people, they're more open to other ideas and other ways of life. And so I think it's a really enriching experience in that sense too. These are a few pictures of things that didn't make it into the book, but again, just explain my love of travel. Seeing the Northern Lights in Finland was an absolute high point of my life. Going to the pyramids in Mexico, totally different experience from Egypt. I love the Mexican pyramids. It was fantastic. Riding an elephant in Thailand, swimming with the manatees down in Florida. Bryce Canyon, my favorite national park in the United States. Seeing the lava flows in Hawaii, the bears in the Rockies. And I love this picture here. That was actually in Finland. I stayed on a husky farm where they train the huskies that do the dog sledding. So there were just like 100 of these amazingly beautiful husky dogs, and they were so friendly. As I was kind of putting the finishing touches on the book, I came across this quote that just kind of, I thought, summed things up perfectly for me. It was, traveling, it leaves you speechless, and then it turns you into a storyteller. And I think that's what it has done for me. So thank you so much. This is thank you in all the languages that we've talked about today.